The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the hosts and guests, and not necessarily those of the staff and management of WWDB-TV.
Get yourselves together. Right. Stand up and live your life. Right. Get yourselves together. Right. Hands up high.
Hey! Welcome to the Rise Above show. I am Joe Peroni.
I'm Heidi Mancini, and today we welcome Paul Elam, the most prominent men's rights activist in the world.
And also star of the Red Pill movie, and he's also is founder of An Ear for Men and A Voice for Men.
Oh, wow.
And the movie. And yeah, we've had some interesting conversations at our house about your work, that's for sure.
I can imagine.
So Paul, so you just you moved to, you just moved. I don't want to tell everybody unless you want to tell them. So
no, I
you
don't
just
mind.
moved?
I live in Roanoke, Virginia. I had lived in Houston, Texas most of my life, and got tired of the large city and moved out east here, and have enjoyed every minute of it.
So you got your room set up like you do on the, I see on the videos. Do you have the Pink Floyd poster up yet?
Oh yes, I have 3 or 4.
You do?
I take them out sometimes along with my T-shirts.
So that's your greatest band of all time, Pink Floyd?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we can have a good conversation about that,
I
too.
mean, I could talk to you for an hour about Pink Floyd if you want to.
Joe could talk to you for an hour about The Who, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, so we'll do that, just on a different show. So I wanted to tell you this. So leading up to the show, I told everybody that we were going to have you on the show. And I said, look, we were looking at the leading men's rights activists in the world. And the first thing that most people said was, I thought men had all the rights. You know, that's the first thing. And then the other part to it was, you could see, especially if it was a woman, this simmering of anger. Like,
Sure.
Why do you even need rights? Or, you know, that type of thing. So I'm going to send it to you. Well, why do you think that is? Why do you think people feel like that?
Well, I take it that all the men that you asked or that you mentioned that you were talking to a men's rights activist who scratched their head and said, what do you mean men have all the rights? I take it none of those were walking out of a family court.
You're right about that, yes.
None of them were the target of a Me Too complaint.
True.
None of them were at any time in their lives drafted into the military and forced into combat. Look, I get it. We live in a society that assumes that men have all the rights. Of course, you know what they say about assumptions.
Yes.
When you start looking closer at matters, though, and that includes matters like family courts and conscription, and a lot of other things. The fact that men go into college campuses these days, 60% of college students that will get their degrees are female, which is great. I mean, I don't know anybody has a problem for that, but every office, every ancillary service, every special service on every university campus, every gender studies program, all of it, all focuses on women, despite the fact that they have overtaken the lead academically on men across the board for bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and now PhDs. There is an imbalance there that spreads across a lot of different things in the culture, and we could even start, and again, and it gets into religious convictions too, but how about the right not to be have your genitals mutilated when you're born, which I think Ann Coulter said we made that illegal 20 minutes after we found out it was happening to girls. Yet it's ritualized and done to boys for profit without compunction across the board, despite the fact that a mountain of research says it's not a good practice.
You know, Paul, one of the things I want to mention is that when you said the Me Too movement, most of the women that I come into contact with during the day, they don't agree with the Me Too movement, and I'm not sure who's so active about that with the men with the sexual harassment, but most of the women that I talk to during the day, they'll say to me, you know, I think it's ridiculous. We all know that things happen or things are said. So most of the women I run into contact with, they don't agree with it, you know, at all. And then when I say to them, you know, when I mentioned, you know, I'll be honest with you, when I listened to some of your shows, Joe wanted me to listen. At first I was taken back, and I actually had to pause. I shut your shows down, and I said, I can't listen to this guy. And then I would, you know, be on the bike at the gym, or I would be, you know, at home, and I would turn it on. I'd say I had to listen to him again. And I do listen to you, and I hear what you're saying, and I'm empathetic, and I wasn't before. And I think a lot of women, if they're told what's going on, or we recruit more women so they understand this, I think they would be empathetic, but I think we don't realize how bad it is for men, because we take for granted, you know, I'm with a good guy, but I take for granted, you know, his strifes that he goes through, and then when he tries to tell me, I sometimes am not that empathetic, because I think about myself first, and some of the stuff that I've gone through being a female, which honestly, I talked to a girl today, and I said, we can't complain as women today that we're oppressed, or that we can't have opportunities, because we do have so many. So I guess my point of that is there are a lot of women that are on the man's side. I just think that they're not aware, or they don't think about your part of how you feel. And when you go to court for your children, you have to fight for your kids, and it's in the woman's favor. And yet we're supposed to live in such an equal society, and yet it gets more slanted now towards the females.
Absolutely, and I understand. Look, I get it. This stuff is hard to listen to, and certainly with somebody with my style of delivery can be very difficult, even though I do have a lot of women followers and supporters of my work. This discussion itself is hard for women to hear. I know that. But the fact that it is so hard for women to hear is in itself evidence of what I'm talking about. People do, like you mentioned at the beginning when we first started talking, they scratch their heads or they get offended when you mention the term men's rights or men's issues, as though men don't have issues. Mm-hmm. And so one might have to ask, if everything is slanted in favor of men, if men have all the rights, then why is the world so hostile when we try to talk about men's problems? You would think if men had all the rights, if everything was stacked in favor of men, then we would only talk about men's issues and men's rights, and we wouldn't talk about women's.
Mm-hmm. So, Paul, where do you think the pushback comes from most? Because I do know that on YouTube channels, it sells more, I think, to push it that it's against feminism. But just in my everyday life, I really don't know too many women that are what you would call staunch feminists. So I think maybe part of the problem could be just people are not educated, number one. And do you think maybe men ourselves are part of the problem?
Oh, more than women are, by far.
Interesting.
The problem, feminism is a problem. It is not the problem. Feminism, first of all, there were some feminist objectives 40, 50 years ago plus, even further back, voting, having rights that women weren't granted in much earlier times, that were honest objectives that I support, even though there's people out there that don't even agree with that. But my take is that those were necessary changes to society. But feminism itself, and it's why so many women don't identify as a feminist, I think most people know feminism is no longer, if it ever was, a movement for women's equality. It's a political power grab, just like a lot of other political movements. It's victim ideology.
Right.
But the part of the problem is just sort of human nature. I don't know if you've heard the expression that civilization will only last to the next oil change without men.
Right. That's fine.
But what that's saying is that all the dirty jobs, all the dangerous stuff, 93% of workplace mortality, workplace deaths are men. All the things it takes to keep the world running that's done out of our sight so that we can live nice, comfortable, convenient lives in air-conditioned buildings is all done by men, almost exclusively. And when we start talking about paying attention to men's issues, men's rights, men's vulnerabilities, it threatens that order. And somewhere deep in us, psychologically, we don't want to hear about men's vulnerabilities because we need them in oil fields. We need them behind the wheels of semis. We need them on battlefields. And so when you start having this conversation about men's humanity, them being human beings, having vulnerabilities and needs and their own ambitions and dreams outside of taking care of women, it feels threatening on some level. And I think that's where you get a lot of the resistance. Plus, so many men are raised to tie in their identity and their masculinity to being tough and being brave and not complaining, not worrying about anything, just sort of taking it and, be a man, man up, do your thing and don't complain. Don't be a wussy. And there's a lot of that. So when we start talking about the fact that 4 out of 5 suicides are men, even with that staggering statistic, if 4 out of 5 suicides were women, we would be going nuts over the suicide problem. And everybody knows that. 4 out of 5 suicides are men, and you still can't find an organization dedicated to suicide prevention, that will even acknowledge that suicide is a men's issue. And I think that says a lot.
Do you think, Paul, that, I had this talk with Joe yesterday about women get things done. When we find a cause, we get out there and we, fight for whatever it is that we want. And I said to Joe, I said, well, why is it that men are not more proactive in what their needs are and what they want? Because as a woman, I was raised a certain way traditionally with my dad, and there's a little bit of a crossover that kind of goes into the culture too, where, I was led to believe that too, that men are strong, men take care of you. You want a strong man, and you're not talking about their vulnerabilities. And at the same time, my father said, but get a career and do something for yourself so that you can take care of yourself if you ever have to. So there was a double message there for me. And honestly, as a female, I don't want to speak for all women out there, but I do think that it's not purposefully done that women sit back and we hate men or that we're not empathetic. I think we just don't understand what really goes on, and it's like, how do you get the message out there? And just for one more moment, when I listened to some of your things too, one of the reasons I was a little bit taken back was the delivery. And when I hear women talk too, sometimes when they put men down and they talk, bad about men, it's like, how do you get the message across without making the opposite sex look like they're being harmful or uncaring?
It's a really difficult balance to find. And part of the answer I found, at least for what I've carved out for myself to do, is to understand that I'm going to offend some people, and not just women. I'm going to offend men too. And I think, though, that if you look through the entire body of my work, you'll see that I'm actually a lot harder on men than I am on women. I hold men's feet to the fire. I don't want a men's movement that mirrors feminism. I don't want to see a bunch of men whining for government money, for special treatment. I don't want to see them act like I see feminists act. But I do want to see men learn how to speak up for themselves. And that sort of gets to a part of the issue that you were talking about when it comes to men speaking up. Yeah, I've been speaking up for on the client side for 25 years, and I've been a lot louder and since the internet really became available for this for 10 years. And I've spoken up loudly. I have been much more critical of men than women, which is ostensibly acceptable in this society. But because I've spoken up so much for so long, I've been named my website's been named as part of a hate movement by the Southern Poverty Law Center. I have had Time Magazine, Newsweek, the New York Times, and a long list of publications across the world write hit pieces on me as a woman hater, a misogynist. And that is what comes with speaking up for men's issues. Some might say that's my delivery. Well, not really. If you look at Warren Farrell, who was actually my inspiration for getting involved in men's issues, we call him the Mr. Rogers.
He's great. Very soft-spoken, and he still gets attacked.
Guy, and still gets slaughtered in the press. It makes no difference. If you speak about men's issues, you're going to be attacked.
So, Paul, I want to tell you a story, and then I'll see what you think about it. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right, so about 2 years ago, with a couple of friends, Heidi and I, we went to this Las Vegas sex museum. Now, it's kind of what you would think it would be, right? I mean, you go there, it's kind of fun, there's some educational stuff. But there was this one area on the far side, there was this wall. And what it was is that people could write their experiences or how they felt about some type of sexual abuse, rape and things like this. And I spent a lot of time. I was reading it, and as you might imagine, it's heartbreaking, right? People are just, talking about this stuff, and at least it was a way for them to get out some feelings. So there's this wall, and it changes obviously all the time because more and more people are writing messages about this, and it's really heartbreaking. Obviously, there's no one in the world that wants to have anybody go through sexual abuse. That's the first part of it. Way on the other side of the building, though, I noticed this other exhibit, and it said the 10 hottest women pedophiles. And they numbered them 1 through 10, and they had these pictures of them, trying to make them look more beautiful, let's say. Right. And they even had a list, like a Super Bowl football team, of how many wins they've had. And under each beautiful woman pedophile was how many victims they had. But interestingly enough, they didn't call them victims. They said relationships, Right. It was like, and I'm looking at that and I'm going, okay, so my heart breaks on one side for these women that were abused. You walk to the other side of the building and they're literally making fun of men who have been through similar situations, and they're exalting women pedophiles. Like, I don't understand this. And if you're a man, you're not allowed to talk about it. Like, it's not allowed to offend you. You have to just be like, okay, because if it was really offensive to people, I don't think that they would have this as a big section of a sex museum. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's unfortunately, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about, and unfortunately it's not contained to your experience there. If you look across the media right now, when you see news stories online and in hard copy newspapers about women pedophiles or school teachers that molest their students, 11, 12, 13 years old, they characterize the events as sleeping with or sex romp, which is a real common one.
Affair.
If the perpetrator is female and the victim is male, then it's a relationship. If the perpetrator is male and the victim is female, then it's a rape. This is, when we talked earlier about what I saw as the core problem of we are pathologically protect women and we pathologically attack men, that is part of the human condition, unfortunately. And we see it played out all the time. And your experience there says to me exactly what I see across the culture. I've written dozens of complaints to publications across the world saying, why are you characterizing this sexual predator as though they're not a perpetrator, and as though their victim isn't a victim? And of course, they never even respond. But it's not just in the Sex Museum in Vegas. It's everywhere. And it's, personally, I find it disgusting and very sad.
So the problem there, where does it really start again? Is it unempathetic women, or is it men that just act like there's no problem, because if they did, then they're losing their man card because they're complaining?
It's both.
Both.
We use a term in the men's movement frequently, gynocentrism, which could easy enough to figure out what it means. Just basically, we see the world in many ways as woman-centered, whereas maybe the average person who says, well, men have all the rights, they think the world is male-dominated. And there's certainly, if you look at Congress or you look at the percentage of male versus female CEOs, it's easy to understand why people look at that and say the world is male-centered. But there is many more parts to the world than Congress and Fortune 500 companies. There's schools, universities, elementary schools, churches, all kinds of organizations. And when you look at our social codes, you know, who buys drinks, who pays, who's expected to protect and provide, you start seeing a world that's not so, male-dominated so much as it is woman-centric.
Right.
And talking about that with people is, it's sort of like mentioning men's rights to people. If you start talking about the world being woman-centered and women having the breaks and burdens being on men, they'll get angry at you. Even though in many cases that's the truth. It may not be a pleasant truth or a comfortable truth or a very convenient truth, but it is the truth.
I think too, Paul, some things are culturally driven too.
Sure.
When you said gynocentric, because I had a discussion with a client the other day, and her and I are about the same age. So, when I dated when I was younger and was taking out, the guy always paid for your drinks, paid for your dinner, and, that kind of thing. And we were having a discussion, and she said, am I wrong to say that this guy should be, if he's courting me, to pay for my drinks and my food? And I said, I don't know. I think that would be something you'd have to discuss with him. But again, she was from the same kind of generation that I came from. And I said, I think that's more of a belief thing of how we were raised. If we're going to be equal, and this is what it comes down to now, is if we're going to be equal as humans on the planet, regardless male or female, my answer would be it's equal. You each pay for each other's yourself. It's hard to answer those questions, but some of the younger girls that I run across that are young, that are in their 20s and 30s, these girls are so independent that they don't expect, the man to pay for, their dinner. They'll pay for their own stuff, but they almost have a, I don't want to say it's an axe to grind, but it's kind of, they're on the other side of it. Well, I make enough money that I can have a baby by myself. I can support myself. What do I need a man for? So of course I'd pay for my own dinner. So there seems to be a little bit of a crossover that gets confusing as to what's the right thing to do.
Yeah, it is. The world has changed. Women work now. There is a lot more independence. I personally think that's a good thing, that there's more independence. I think that you can take that too far when you start talking about, especially about, I don't need a man for a child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
I'm
disagree.
like, wait a minute. Well, maybe, lady, your child does.
Absolutely.
that is a horrific mistake to think that children don't need fathers. But I tell men now all the time, and still, even though things are changing, my guess would be, I read a study 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm sure it's even changed a little bit since then as things have moved on and progressed, that about 44% of women not only didn't want to pay for a date, would be offended if they were expected to pay. And so in the men that I work with, what I tell them is, as you start a relationship, that's how it'll go. And if you want a woman that carries her weight, you need to get it straight from the beginning that you're not here to finance a relationship, which will cost you at least half the women you would have had a chance with. But again, my work with men is focused on encouraging them to find non-gynocentric ways to live. That, okay, yeah, so you'll lose. Maybe that's the half of women you wanted to lose. Maybe you want a woman that looks at the world a different way and says, yeah, I have a job, I make money, I can carry my own weight. Why don't we share? And wouldn't that be a better partner for you? And I think they are better partners. I mean, that's what I did in my own life. I'm 16 years in a relationship that I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. But I didn't lead into it with my wallet. But it took a lot of courage.
But I think the sharing part is what we've lost in society, because I think we become so, I hate this word narcissistic because it's used every single day and I'm overhearing it, but I think we kind of lost that whole thing about sharing, about being in a relationship, whether it's a friendship, romantic. It seems like, to me, you hear, I don't know, people are out for their own agenda sometimes, and I, like I said to my client, I said, maybe you have to determine that from the beginning, what the rules of the relationship are going to be before you even get started. And I said to her, and if you're offended or you're not okay because the guy's not going to buy you drinks or buy you dinner, then you know right from the beginning, again, what you just said about the men, then maybe that's not the kind of man that you want to be with. So it's both sexes kind of setting their own guidelines and boundaries as to how you want to be, but also not criticizing each other for those boundaries.
But let me play devil's advocate for a moment to one thing you said about, and I agree with you, as we've moved along with each generation, they've progressively gotten more shallow, more narcissistic. I think sometimes we're creating a world of personality disorders. But generally with men, whether it was men from my generation, and I'm 61, or men that are now 18, generally with men, what is on their mind with women is what do they have to do to gain that woman's acceptance. It is not selfishness. It is not me. It's what do I have to do to make her smile? What do I have to do to make her want me? What do I have to do to make her approve of me?
True.
And yes, I hear the male voice in there saying, yes, this is the way men operate with women. And it's literally, in today's age, emotional suicide to operate that way.
Paul,
we don't teach men to have standards in women. We don't teach them to say, wait a minute, okay, yeah, she's hot, she's pretty, but wait a minute. I mean, what do you mean? What do I have to do to get her approval? What about your approval? What are your standards? What are your needs in a relationship? And men, for the most part, do not think about that until they are about my age.
Yeah.
So, Paul, you were a therapist a long time ago?
Yes.
All right, tell me if you think this is true or not, because I'm a therapist now also. And again, not to offend, right? You have to kind of throw that out there for certain people, but when you're a marriage and family therapist and you see a man sitting on your couch, his major problem is that he's extremely sad that his wife is not happy.
Right.
And then when you look at the wife, she's extremely sad that she's not happy.
Right.
So the one thing that they have in common is that they both care about her happiness. So I think that's, I mean, do you find that to be true? So all the resources go to the woman because the man doesn't care. He's willing to put away all of his wants, needs, and everything as long as she's happy. Do you find that to be true?
Not only do I find that to be true, I also find in my extensive experience working with LMFTs, or licensed marriage and family therapists, that they enable that scenario.
Absolutely.
That the modus operandi for these people is that the male is the identified problem the moment they walk in the door.
That's true.
And that the reason they're there is that she has drugged him in, and the objective is to get the therapist to align with her to fix him and to get him to do what the wife wants. And most therapists out there, most family therapists out there, are only too happy to oblige because that's their bread and butter. So yes, that's what happens. And when I talked about young men going into relationships saying, you know, what do I have to do to please her? These same guys will be in marriages miserable 25 years later, sitting around pulling their hair out saying, what on earth do I have to do to make her happy? I mean, and when we talk about men's suicide rate and their level of happiness, I mean, this has to play a role in men's general level of misery in life.
Absolutely.
And it's very hard for women to hear this. But I think it's a necessary conversation.
Paul, we have to take a 15-second break, and we'll be right back. Don't hang up.
Sure thing.
Okay.
I'm the world's worst cleaning lady. I'm here in your home having a pretty spectacular Tuesday. But I don't notice the loose rug at the top of your stairs. And that's about to become an issue for me. And if you've got the wrong home insurance coverage, my medical bills could get expensive. So get Allstate.
There are many insurance companies out there, but none can compare with McDonough Family Insurance. We take time to get to know each and every customer's individual needs. We want you to feel like part of the family and pride ourselves in protecting what matters most to you. Our agency offers all types of insurance, including life, auto, home, health, renters, and business owner policies. We strive for excellence each and every day to make sure that whatever situation arises in your life, you can feel safe, secure, and confident. One call to McDonough Family Insurance Agency will make your world brighter. Call us at 702-684-6989. That's 702-684-6989. We're always here with a smile and ready to help you. McDonough Family Insurance Agency, the company that cares.
Welcome back to the Rise Above Show. I am Joe Peroni.
I'm Heidi Mancini.
And we have Paul Elam with us, the most prominent men's rights activist in the world. Paul, can you hear us?
Yes, sir, I can.
All right. So we've been enjoying this conversation. So let's continue this a little bit.
Okay, Joe.
So gynocentrism, I get it, and I'm on board. Like, we know that that's a problem. But as therapists like we are, let's look maybe a little bit somewhere else, like a little bit deeper.
Okay.
Because I'm seeing another problem here, you know, as we're talking too, is that what about capitalism? And I don't mean like anti-government stuff like that. I'm not talking about that. I just mean, let's take the therapist. If, let's say, 85% of your clientele that's going to come in is female, you're going to necessarily try to please her before you are a man. You know, that's one part of it. Or another part of it, if women spend about 85% of the disposable income in the United States, if you're a business person, don't you think that people slide all their businesses towards making women happy at the expense of men?
Oh, sure they do. That's why you see so much commercial advertising where men are played as idiots
Yeah.
And women are the smart, empowered ones, because you're right. In consumer culture, about 85% of liquidable income is in the control of women, and certainly psychotherapy as an industry is predominantly a woman's area. So that's what they appeal to. That's why you have these great self-help books called Women Who Love Too Much, and Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them. That's the market. That's what the market bears out. And I think consumerism is part of the problem. I wouldn't necessarily, I have to admit, I'm a diehard capitalist. But,
True. No, listen, I am too. But what I'm saying is that we have to figure out solutions here. Like, we can think about where the problems are. There's no doubt there. But once we can find the problem, then how do we work through it and around it? Because we like capitalism. But as men, it certainly doesn't work for us if we're talking about men's rights.
Absolutely. And this conversation is part of that. Part of what I do. My work mainly isn't really activism. It's promoting men's mental health and having the kind of discussion we're having right now. And I've targeted a male audience and have a fairly significant male clientele that's geared toward these issues. I think part of the solution is convincing clinicians to pay attention to men's issues. But then it's not just the market that dictates this stuff. It's that sort of thing, because just because somebody has MA or MSW or PhD after their name, these are some of the same people that scratch their heads when you say men's issues or men's rights.
Right.
They still have the same denial, the same ignorance of these issues that most of the population does. So you can talk to some of them all day long till you're blue in the face, but I think at the end all I can do is the best I can do, and I was blessed in a way. The first 30 years of my clinical work was with alcohol and drug abuse. And that's a population where, you can't afford to give a damn whether you bother your clients. They're dying.
Right.
And so they get the double-barreled truth out of you, and that was a great setup for doing what I'm doing now. So I think maybe some of that population of people, if they're are really good, can add to this. But I think part of it, if I sense what you're getting at, Joe, is that you're right, that there has to be a market created to help men.
Which I think is, I've been thinking about this. I mean, you're the leader in this, but I think it's a really difficult proposition, because one of the first things we need to do as men is allow ourselves to be vulnerable, because then that's where a conversation can start. What do you think?
Yes, and I'm going to say there's a two-sided coin to that, and this maybe would explain some more of my work to Heidi, too, because, again, I can't imagine. I know some great women in this movement that I work with, people like Janice Fiamingo and Karen Strawn and others that are just these incredibly strong, gifted women that do incredible work and support what I do, and they are very rare, because this stuff is really hard for most women to listen to. But what they get about this that's so important is not only do we need to allow men to be vulnerable, we need to allow men to be angry. Injustice is supposed to make human beings angry. And the one thing the world is most fearful of is men's anger. I mean, I've been attacked as you're angry, as though just the fact that I'm angry makes me wrong.
I'll take you one step more for you. Just the fact that you're a man and you might be of somewhat, say, substance. I mean, me as a bodybuilder, I just have to stand there, and I'm a threat. And how tall are you?
6'8".
All right. All right, that's what I thought. How much do you weigh?
About 270.
All right, so you don't have to say a word, do you? Like,
No.
you just walk into a room and there's probably, you go to a restaurant, there's probably 15 women in that room that are already looking at you going, that guy could be a potential threat.
Yeah. and I've learned to adapt to that. I when I'm in person with people I don't know, I make sure to keep the distance between our bodies a little extra
Yeah.
than I would with people I'm close to, because you're right, just the size alone is intimidating.
Don't you find that there's a sadness to that, though, man? Like,
Yes.
I mean, it's ridiculous. Like, I'll tell you what I love about bodybuilding shows. It's full-on testosterone. That's it. And that's what you get, that's what the people are going to cheer for. You go out there, you look as big and as muscular and as manly as you can. But I got to tell you, in everyday life, I have to put on this, like, little bit of an air, especially if I'm, go into the agency where I work with, and they're all female therapists. You have to have this nice, soothing, caring voice, and I don't talk like that, right? And it's like you have to, you don't have to, I guess. You choose to play the game, or else you're going to be singled out as some angry guy that's a rapist in waiting.
Well, and I got to say, I'm guilty as the rest. I mean, I've seen you on YouTube. I'd be very polite to you.
So, Paul, if you don't want to answer my next question, you don't have to. But the therapist in me just, I want to know some more stuff about you.
Sure.
Okay, so you're 6'8". You can't hide, number one. Number two, when you speak about the things you do, you make yourself a target.
Yep.
And so these things are really difficult, I would imagine. Knowing that, it means that you must care to the deepest part of your core about your work. So I'm wondering, where is the maybe loss of connection, or the hole in your heart from a long time ago that made you say, I'm going to withstand all of this because I have something to say?
That's a really good question, and I'm not going to be evasive at all with you. I'm not sure I can articulate the correct answer, but I will try.
Okay.
Part of it, as with everybody, is family dynamics. I was a family black sheep, and so you're a therapist, you're familiar with family roles, hero children, lost children, scapegoats,
absolutely,
those sort of thing. And I was the black sheep of the family. It was my job. My family hired me to point to the elephant in the room and make sure everybody couldn't ignore it. That was my job in life. And looking back on it as a clinical professional, I would tell you, well, that's child abuse. My parents would tell you that was my professional development.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is that. Part of it, though, is that I guess for some people more than others, there is a built-in distaste for injustice. I remember being 13 years old, going through a newspaper. This was back in 1969, 1970, and seeing in the help wanted part of the newspaper that all the crappy jobs were for women. They were divided back then, women's employment and men's employment. I don't know if either one of you are old enough to remember that, but
I was 5 then, but...
Okay, but it was divided, men's employment and women's employment. And the women's employment was always like Gal Friday, secretary, whatever, and all the important jobs were men. I remember at 13 years old being angry about that.
Wow.
That it wasn't right. I was angry about, by the time I was 15, 16, I was angry about racial injustice. I didn't like it. And I was always rooting for the underdog. And in 1993, I read a book by Warren Farrell called The Myth of Male Power, in which he challenged our notions of what power was, about what was the real lived experience of both sexes, not just what you saw on television and not just what was happening in Fortune 500 companies, but what was happening on the backs of garbage trucks, in ditches, in our oil fields, in our war zones. What were the lives of men really like? And then what was the rhetoric about men? That they had all the power, that they had too much power, they needed to surrender power, and men were arrogant and chauvinistic and macho and literally no good. Well, when I woke up to that part of the world, it was just me being me, rooting for another underdog. Only this time, unlike all the other things, I remember telling my mother I didn't think it was right that women were excluded from things when I was very young. And it almost brought tears to her eyes. She was so happy that I was that observant. And then when I spoke up about other matters of injustice, I got a lot of reinforcement from people for doing it. But when I started speaking up about men, the world lost its shit. And it was brutal. I mean, literally, I had horrible conflicts with my peers in the mental health field. I had people trying to sabotage my career, to get me fired, to do all kinds of things to undermine me, because I pointed out one day at work that, hey, I've noticed that we assess every woman that comes in this facility for whether or not that she's been a victim of domestic violence. And we assess every man that comes in this facility for whether or not he's been a perpetrator of domestic violence. And I've got a client right now that has a big scar on top of his head where he got 20 stitches after his wife slammed him over the head with a fireplace poker.
Wow.
And so why aren't we asking questions about abusive women and male victims? And the reaction was shockingly hostile.
Yeah, I think it goes back to some of the things we touched on today. Like, that's a subject where if we look at the actual evidence in intimate partner violence, we're going to find out that it's about equal, men to women.
Yes, it is.
So, can you say that again? I want everybody to hear that. Yes, it is, right? It's equal.
If you look, for everybody, anybody listening, Google Martin Fiebert, Fiebert, domestic violence, and you will come up with a list of, it's nearly 400 studies covering an aggregate of over 70,000 cases that prove beyond any doubt, beyond any dispute, that women are as violent or more violent than men in relationships. You can also find, researching the CDC, that in unidirectional violence, non-reciprocated, where there's just one person hitting another, 70% of that is committed by women. And that is not
What about the
to say-
emotional violence? Do you know the numbers on that?
Oh, relational aggression
Yes.
is overwhelmingly women. I can't quote the raw numbers on that, but if you look at relational aggression studies, you see this is how, particularly starting in middle school years, this is where girls begin to demonstrate relational aggression, running in packs, undermining each other, shunning, things like that happen. And of course, that also gets carried out in relationships. I'm a little leery of some of this, not because I think the data is bad. I think the data is good. But I don't want a dialogue that points at women and says they're the problem.
Right.
Violence, both relational aggression, physical violence, all this stuff is part of the human condition. And it's passed down from generation to generation. There's a number of reasons for physical violence: alcoholism, mental health issues, underemployment, unemployment, childhood abuse. There's a long list of things that contribute to domestic violence. And the one thing that does not contribute to it is the sex of the perpetrator. Yet we live in this big fantasy world that insists that domestic violence is defined by wife beating.
Right.
That's simply not true. But to complete my answer to you earlier about what part of me is driven by this,
Yes.
is that when I started speaking about men, I got tremendous pushback And it scared me a little bit at first, but then it made me recognize that there was a really unaddressed area that needed a broader discussion. And what can I say? I'm Texan, and I like a good fight.
Well, I think you should keep fighting.
I'm trying.
So,
Because I'm going to tell you, I'm going to interrupt you,
Oh,
interrupt
no,
you
go
for one
ahead.
second. Ever since when I invited you on the show a month ago, I've been talking to a lot of my clients that are females, friends that are females, and I have to tell you, I'm actually surprised too at the pushback that I get when I say this is what we're going to be talking about, men's rights, and most of the women, and I love my clients and I love the women in my life, but again, you do get the pushback. I get it a little bit, and then I have to start explaining to them what I mean about what I just said about men's rights. And then once we get into it a little bit, then they kind of soften up and they go, "Yeah, okay, I understand it now." But most women, when you initially say that to them, they're like, "What do they need men's rights for?" They have a very, I don't know, negative response to start with. So I think pushing back is the way to go. And I think the only way
I do
anything's
too.
going to ever get done is that you just got to keep pushing, no matter what's in your heart. You're going to get the people that are going to listen, and eventually the other people that don't want to listen are going to be forced to listen.
One of the things that we're fortunate now, since, God bless her, since Cassie J made the Red Pill movie, one of the things I've been able to do is for people that have 1,000 questions or just say, I'm not buying it or whatever, I can say, look, go to Amazon, or, Amazon has the Red Pill movie, and watch it. And that'll explain to you what we mean by this.
And after you watch that, you can't. Joe and I watched it one day together, and again, I was kind of like, okay, I'll watch it, and then after you watch it, you feel sad. You're like, holy crap! Like, I didn't realize that, those are things that men go through. We don't, and I don't know if it's because we're uncaring. I don't want to say I'm an uncaring person, or maybe not aware would be a better word, to use, because I don't want to think that I'm that uncaring. But after I watched that with Joe, I said, wow, I didn't realize that men had all these issues.
Well, and I don't think it means anybody's uncaring. I just think, like I said, we're wired. And if you look at it historically at the human species, at the African savanna, back when, it was immediate survival, it made sense that we had to ignore things that affected men in order to take care of women. It just, and throughout a lot of prehistory and even most of modern history, it made sense that we couldn't have the luxury of loading men into the lifeboats. So this is part of the human condition. It doesn't mean that, there's a lot of compassionate people that scratch their heads at men's rights. But it is a process of unlearning some stuff and stopping to think, because most of our reaction to this stuff is automatic. It isn't really thoughtful. But just like you just described, when you watched the movie and stopped and thought for a few minutes, it puts you in touch with the compassion that you have. And so it's all good.
So, Paul, we just have a couple of minutes left. So
Sure.
I thought, being the leader that you are, I'm going to ask you this question. And of course, you can not answer if you don't want to.
I'll try my best.
But let's see if you're the leader that you are. Tell me, when was the last time that you cried?
Oh, God.
If we want to be leaders, we have to be the vulnerable ones, right? To let men know that it's okay.
A few months ago, I went to my P.O. box, and if I even talk about this, I could cry right now. I went to my P.O. box and got an envelope, and there was $3 in it, and a note from a guy apologizing, saying this is all he had, that child support, he was fighting to stay out of jail, and that he didn't really have money, but he felt like he wanted to do something to support my work. And I was crying in my car on my way home that day.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I've talked to some men And yeah, it's really difficult.
It is.
Really difficult. So I want to thank you for doing our show today, and for all the work that you do. I know you help a lot of people, and I'm sure you know that, but I felt like I needed to tell you that anyway.
Well, thank you very much for that, and it's been a pleasure talking with both of you.
Thank you, Paul. We appreciate you.
And Paul, before you go, can you tell everybody where they can reach you, and all your websites and everything are?
Absolutely. My main website is avoiceformen.com. I'm also at anearformen.com. My YouTube channel is An Ear for Men. Please come subscribe, and if you really want to support my work out there, guys, please come to my Patreon, which is Patreon/An Ear for Men, and you can support my work there. I produce 8 videos a month, talks for men, about life and relationships in the modern world.
Okay.
Thanks for doing the show today, and hopefully you can come back on.
It's been a great pleasure. I'd love to do it anytime.
Thank
you so
This
much,
has been the
Paul.
Rise Above Show. I am Joe Peroni,
I'm Heidi Mancini.
and our special guest,
Paul Elam.
Paul Elam. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.